Hi guys, my name is Shanice. In this video, my project partner, Carrie, and I will be taking a look at a few of the slave revolts that occurred in resistance to slavery in the Caribbean. Uprisings against slavery were actually frequent and became more successive in the later centuries. So in this video, we will just be discussing a few of them. It must be noted that although this video is concerned with chattel slavery of African peoples, resistance to slavery began from as early as the onset of European settlement in 1492, when various Amerindian ethnic groups fought against Spanish invasions. In fact, the depopulation of Amerindians in the Caribbean was not just due to disease or being overworked. Many actually lost their lives rebelling against the Spanish. Because of Amerindian resistance and mortality, African slaves were imported and forced to labor in the colonies in the Greater Antilles. And while this was taking place, there were still Amerindian groups warring the Europeans in the Lesser Antilles, preventing colonizers from settling on those islands. So great was this resistance that the boundary set between the Antilles was known as the Poison Arrow Curtain, named after the favored weapon of the Kalinago people of the Lesser Antilles. This resistance persisted well into the 1700s, even after the mass importation of African slaves to the Caribbean and the decimation of Amerindian populations in the Greater Antilles. The Santo Domingo slave revolt of 1521 was the first written record of African slave revolt in the Caribbean. In 1535, Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo wrote Historia General y Natural de las Indias, or General and Natural History of the Indies. This was a revision to a book he had initially written in 1526. In this book, he wrote of his experiences in Santo Domingo as a gold smelting supervisor, and when he recalled the 1521 rebellion, he wrote,
Up to 20 blacks, and most of them of Wall of Lanui, in agreement, on the second day of Christ's nativity, got out of the sugar estate and went to join at certain place with as many others that were yet with them. And once about 40 of them were together. They killed some Christians that were inadvertent in the fields and continued their way ahead, towards the village of Azua.
According to this source, the slaves of Christopher Columbus's son, Governor Diego Colon, rebelled against him after being subjected to grueling work on the sugar plantations. The slave rebellion was led by Maria Olofa and Gonzalo Mandinga, a couple from the Wolof and Mandinga ethnic groups in West Africa and the first known African cimarrones of the Americas. The uprising was a well-planned collective effort by the slaves who desired to abolish slavery and capture the land by eliminating the Christian European planter class of Santo Domingo. Slaves waged violence against their oppressors and extorted their property, taking their slave masters' jewelry and gold for themselves. The revolt, though short-lived as it was quelled in a day's time, was impactful, striking fear into the Spaniards who executed the rebels and then issued the Ordinances of 1522, which were the first official slave laws that set the standard of strict control over slaves. The laws mandated that slaves were not allowed to visit other plantations, carry arms, earn wages, or even be seen without their master present. Needless to say, slave revolts on Santo Domingo continued for quite some time. The St. John's Slave Rebellion of 1733 was one of the longest-lasting slave rebellions in the Caribbean at the time, spanning almost a year from 1733 to 1734. St. John was an island colonized by the Danish in 1718 and was just one of 3 colonies settled by the Kingdom of Denmark. The colony relied heavily on African slave labor because Danish citizens were not willing to work on the plantations and because prior to colonization, the island was uninhabited, so there were no indigenous populations to capture and enslave. By 1733, more than 1,000 African slaves labored on St. John's 109 plantations. Under the control of the Danish West India and Guinea Company, a steady amount of slaves were shipped to St. John from Fort Christiansburg, which the company erected along the coast of the Gulf of Guinea. Here they traded manufactured goods for slaves, ivory, and gold with the Ga and the Kwamu ethnic groups that inhabited modern-day Accra, Ghana. The weakening of the Kwamu kingdom after a civil war in the early 1700s saw the subsequent enslavement of the Kwamu people themselves, who were captured as prisoners of war by neighboring groups and sold to be shipped to St. John as slaves. Now, during the time the Akwamu began arriving at St. John, the colony was being plagued by long periods of drought, causing many slaves to run away and settle as maroons in the forest. This led to Governor Philip Gardelaine's written code of 1733, which ordered that runaways be killed, and also listed a number of other stipulations under which slaves were to be brutally punished. Even looking at a planter maliciously or talking back had severe consequences. Here we can see an important pattern emerging. So great was the need to deter slave rebellions that the Europeans had to create laws not only to deal with marooning, but to list the ways in which Europeans were allowed to exercise power and total domination over African slaves. The Caribbean was where chattel slavery took its most extreme judicial form, the slave code. Through codes like these, the plantation became what plantation society theorists dubbed a total institution. The plantation became a slave's whole world, their economic, social, cultural, and psychological experiences being shaped by it. Through the functions of law, the colonizers forced a rigidly stratified plantation system, placing themselves at the top of the hierarchy and the slaves at the bottom in order to maintain the forms of social organization that were intrinsic to the plantation society and crucial to its success. These demoralizing laws, paired with drought and exploitation, proved to be too much for the newly arrived Akwamu slaves to bear, so they immediately began planning to revolt. Because St. John was a small, barely profitable colony, it lacked the resources and personnel that it would have needed to fend off the rebels. The Akwamu were able to slaughter their slave masters, starting at Coral Bay and then moving throughout the various plantations. The Danish would try to enlist the help of their other colony, St. Thomas, and the British in nearby Tortola and St. Christopher, but any military presence on the island was easily subdued by the Akwamu people. Things went on like this for quite some time. Of an attempt by a Captain Maddox to capture the Akwamus, the English governor Matthews wrote,
"On St. John the Danes at present hardly have possession. Their negroes rose upon them about 6 months ago. At my first arrival I heard they had quelled their slaves, but it was not so. They have in a manner drove the Danes off. At least they dare not now attempt any more to reduce these negroes, who have always beaten them, and in a manner are masters of that island. The governor of St. Thomas was even modest enough to desire I would send some ships to reduce them, and I now learn a rash fellow from St. Christopher's, in open defiance of my positive orders to the contrary, having made a compact with the Danish governor, went with his 2 sons and 3 or 24 more on this errand, that the negroes have killed one if not both his sons, and 2 or 3 more of his company, and beaten them off."
Meanwhile in Europe, the tides were turning. France wanted to wage war with Poland but was struggling financially after all the other wars they were involved in. The Danish offered to buy St. Croix from them and remain neutral in France's war in exchange for assistance with the rebellion in St. John. When you think about it, colonization in the Caribbean was an extension of the conflicts and developments taking place on the European continent. From the Spanish War against the Moors in the 1400s to the French Revolution and so on, every major event in Europe had a parallel consequence in the Caribbean colonies. Whole islands were used as economic pawns, stolen and traded to make Europeans more money. Slave rebellion was therefore bad for business. It decreased productivity and profits and inspired more rebellion in neighboring colonies. This was enough reason for colonizers of different nations to occasionally join forces to crush revolts. In April of 1734, France sent 2 vessels to St. John. The French proved to be a dangerous force. Their troops executed what rebels they could find. However, a sizable amount of the Akwamu rebels, not wanting to be captured, committed suicide to escape their doomed fate, a last defiant act against their enslavement. The Carib Wars of 1772 to 1773 and 1795 to 1797 emerged from a struggle in St. Vincent that was quite different from what was taking place on other islands. St. Vincent was the last of the Windward Islands to be totally subjugated by colonialism due to the fierceness of the indigenous population. Labeled Caribs by the Europeans, the Calinas were able to repel colonial domination well into the 1700s when slavery and plantation society were well underway on the other Caribbean islands. The island eventually became a safe haven for slaves that could escape from other colonies by boat. This African population was accepted by the natives and were assimilated into their culture, mixing together for generations and producing black Caribs, which were people of African and Kalina ancestry that fully identified with the native Kalina culture. While this could be considered a more natural possible relationship in the context of colonization, the natives of St. Vincent also had a very strategic alliance with the French. You see, both the natives and the French had a common enemy in the British. France supplied the natives with resources to stave off the British in exchange for allowances of the establishment of a small number of plantations on the island. What this created couldn't really be called a plantation society. The French could not defeat the indigenous peoples and so had to cooperate with them and by extension the Black Caribs. The French were not in a superior position of authority. They had to acquiesce to much of the natives' demands in order to get a foothold on the island. And still, the Calinas, indigenous and African, were the majority landowners on the island. Furthermore, plantation economic activity was not reserved for the whites. Indigenous Calinas, Black Calinas, and Africans all bought, owned, and sold African slaves. Some chiefs, like Châteauguay, even had their own sugar plantations where slaves cultivated the goods that they would trade to the French and British. Before the British gained full control of the island at the end of the Second Carib War in 1797, society in St. Vincent consisted of multiple hierarchies superimposed upon each other. Indigenous and Black Caribs distinguished themselves apart from African slaves, and yet still they often freed their slaves, who then continued to live among them and mix with them. Both Carib groups assimilated a lot of French culture through a mutually beneficial relationship rather than through the cultural erasure that occurred in the slavery system. Free Black Caribs held the same status as indigenous Caribs, and they both fought together against European colonization. However, even though the Caribs and Black Caribs resisted colonization, they actually adopted some elements of the colonial system and benefited from it for over a century. The French and the British oftentimes could not secure themselves within the highest strata of the society because of the Calinas and Africans' resistance and adaptability. Meanwhile, the Europeans fought against each other because of the plantation economy's capitalist nature. Preoccupation with capitalist accumulation pitted Europeans against each other as colonial competition, reducing the ideological need for racial solidarity in the society. The British sought to dismantle the established hierarchies on the island by sensationalizing tensions between the Calinas and Black Caribs, pushing the narrative that the Calinas were the island's true rightful inhabitants at the mercy of the African colonists, the Black Caribs. In this way, they painted the Black Caribs as an impediment to the European civilizing processes which the noble natives so desperately needed. An Englishman stationed on the island wrote,
"We have the greatest reason to think that suffering the Caribs to remain in their present state will be very dangerous, and may at some period prove fatal to the inhabitants of the country, as their situation, surrounded with wood, makes any access to them for the purpose of executing justice impracticable, and they will from thence be capable of committing all outrages unpunished, or harboring the slaves of the inhabitants of this island, as well as of all the neighboring islands, of sheltering amongst those vagabonds and deserters from the French, and in case of a rupture with France, it is probable they will join in distressing the inhabitants, and in an attempt to conquer the colony."
Some indigenous Caribs did shift alliances, choosing to support the British in the expulsion of the Black Caribs. The British eventually proved not to be trustworthy allies though, and enlisted the help of African slaves to capture and execute both Carib groups. Of course, the Europeans wanted total monopoly over the island. This was their ultimate goal. The Caribs' self-sufficiency contradicted the logic of capital accumulation that existed in the plantation economy. Their alternative autonomous systems could not be tolerated by the Europeans because slave labor was the plantation's fundamental workforce. It's important to note that resistance to slavery took on many tribal forms. It was not always seen as freedom for all, but rather freedom for oneself or one's kin group, or freedom for some at the expense of others. The connection between liberation and an inherent equality among all men became more prominent through French revolutionary ideology that passed on from France to Haiti to other Caribbean islands.
The Haitian Revolution and how it relates to slavery and resistance in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture, a nobody who turned into somebody. He was the first and only person to lead a successful revolt in Caribbean history. Toussaint Louverture, whose former name was Toussaint Breda, was born into slavery. He fought to become a free slave, which later paved his way to becoming the leader of his society. How did Toussaint lead the Haitian Revolution? To answer this, we must go way back to the 14th of July, 1789, during the storming of the Bastille, Paris, France, which signaled the start of the French Revolution. It was during this time that the rights of man was read. It stated that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. These rights were liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. By 1791, almost everyone on Saint-Domingue were aware of the storming of the Bastille and the rights of men. This knowledge, paired with communication among enslaved Africans, sparked the fire to cause an explosion known as the Haitian Revolution. On the 14th of July, 1791, a group of slaves met and performed a voodoo ceremony where they swore by blood to revolt. On the 16th of August that same year, a building was set on fire on one of the 100 sugar plantations in France's wealthy Caribbean colony known as Saint-Domingue, today's independent Republic of Haiti. The whites suspected the blacks caused the fire, and under investigation, they got one to confess, and he stated that slaves were going to burn the place and murder the whites. The planters thought that the slaves were uneducated and could not do it, but they were later proven wrong. By the 21st of August, 1791, hundreds of plantation owners were awakened by slaves banging on their doors to kill them. Some planters were hung and stabbed to death, while others were beaten to death. Fires were started and plantations were burned to the ground. Chaos engulfed the island. During this time, slave armies were formed to fight against the planters. It was under Dr. Bastille's slave army Toussaint was given the command of 600 soldiers, where he proved to be a successful fighter, which made his ranks grew to 4,000. While he was still under Bastille's command, he somewhat had his own army, where he met Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who became his friend and right-hand man. While Toussaint's army showed a little more resource towards planters when they were caught, Dessalines showed no mercy by using slavery punishments on the planters, such as gouging out eyes and displaying their body parts on sticks. By 1793, the war was slowly dying as planters were retreating. This provided the perfect time for Spain and Britain to invade Saint-Domingue. While the British went straight into invading the island, Spain came with a plan to join the slave army and offered to respect their freedom if they helped them fight. This caused Spain to gain the upper hand in the battlefield. Toussaint first helped Spain in their Spain versus France fight in 1793 and then switched sides because France in 1784 had abolished slavery. Soon the Spanish retreated from the battlefield and Toussaint started to focus on coastal areas where the British were based. The onslaught of the British caused the general to strike a deal with them. That was, the British would start trading with Saint-Domingue and Louverture would not influence the rebellion on Jamaica. Toussaint was later betrayed by Dessalines, who joined the French in taking control over Saint-Domingue again. Toussaint was later arrested, where he died under the captivity of France. Because Toussaint was focusing on a colorless society where everyone was seen as equal, he was betrayed because most blacks could not forgive the whites for what they did, and most whites could not live in peace with a black man in power. This caused his plan to fail and his army to betray him. But the story doesn't end here. In 1803, Dessalines murdered all the whites on the island because France tried committing genocide against the slave population. Only the British and Americans were spared by Dessalines because he needed their trade to rebuild the economy. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines renamed the nation Haiti and declared independence from France. General Dessalines assumed directorial power, and Haiti became the second independent nation in the Americas. The Haitian Revolution came a long way and ended successful. But what caused slaves to finally revolt? What gave them the extra push during the French Revolution to stand with the rights of men? It could be said that they were simply tired of living in a society of unfair social stratification. In a slavery society, stratification is closed, and a person's race determines where they are placed in society. The whites at the top of the strata, colored and free blacks in the middle of the strata, and enslaved blacks at the bottom. Dependent on an individual's race, they are allowed certain benefits and drawbacks, such as white men would be able to freely do what they want, while black enslaved men could only do as he was told. Life would be unfair since there is little social mobility, and how hard or easy your life will be is determined by your race, which one cannot control or change. Status will be ascribed as if you are born white, you are born free and superior. Under this society, slaves may have grew tired of being seen and treated as inferior, which helped fuel their motive to revolt against their oppressors.